One of the things I find always interesting is to go and look at history. And I hate to say this guy was at Brookings, but he talking to the I think it was a Joint Economic Committee that Japan is replacing America as the world's strongest economic power. It is in everyone's interest that the transition goes smoothly. Well, you don't hear that too much about Japan anymore. But throughout American history, we've had this whole pattern where first it was the model of either Stalin or the fascist countries, and then the Russians were going to pass us. Then it was the Europeans, and it was the Japanese. Today it's the Chinese, and among some the Indians. And I think this is obviously something that can happen, but doesn't tend to happen in the long run for reasons that I think are reasonably clear in the sense of what the U.S. has going for it. Basically, we have healthier long-term demographics, birth rate, population growth rate. We're the only advanced large country with a large growing population. We have a fairly resilient economic system and manages hopefully to survive the idiots in both parties. As you can see, unlike many of the people here, I really don't have a political party. And that basically we need to address our problems with more of what I would call back to basics approach. I don't know how much time we'll have to get into that. Interesting thing about the world in general, I'm working a lot in London now, and one of the things is I think we're in a very interesting and crucial 40 years in the world, while population growth rates are really going down in a way that the Malthusians never predicted, including the one who's in the White House right now, the science advisor to the president. The fact of the matter is that the growth rates are really dropping in a very good way, and it's certainly good in the developing world. But we're still going to have about 3 billion more people by, I guess that's pretty much the consensus, by 2050. And so that's going to be obviously a big factor in the future. And the U.S. will have growth, and I've heard everything up to 500 million, but I usually take my lead from Bill and try to say probably around 400 million is a pretty safe estimate by 2050. Could be higher, could be a little bit lower, but it's basically what you can expect. The big difference between the U.S. and its major competitors is that we have a little bit higher birth rate plus immigration. I look at those 2050 numbers. You're talking about countries like Japan, Korea, Germany being at 35% over 65. I really think this is terra incognita. We have no idea what a society will be like with that many elderly people. We really, but we probably a lot of it's not going to be very pretty. I always like the story that Bill tells of speaking in Japan, and they come to him and they say, we don't understand how Americans keep having kids. And I always say, well, you know what, if you have to ask that question, you're in more trouble than I thought. I mean, the fact of the matter is that for lots of reasons, I think it has a lot to do with lack of space, societal pressures. But for whatever reason, all these countries are experiencing more rapid aging than we are. I thought this was really interesting because if we're looking into the future, labor force growth. Now, this is a two-way street. Obviously, you have a huge reduction in the labor force in Korea, Europe, and Japan, but also China by about 2030, 2040 starts going into negative. One of my students at Chapman, a Chinese woman, did a study on Chinese population. Apparently what had happened is that Mao pushed having as many kids as possible and did it and so the population of China, which was never small, got very, very large. Deng Xiaoping felt he had to do something radical, which he did, but then there are unforeseen consequences, such as the surplus of boys as opposed to girls. That's probably good if you're in the prostitution or pornography industry, but probably not all that good for the society. And the other day I was at a Chinese New Year celebration, and in the room next to us was a banquet of adopted Chinese kids, all of whom were girls. And so that's obviously a long-term situation. Now, what this really means essentially is not that Europe or Japan or or Korea are worse than we are or inferior or anything like that. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. What I am suggesting is they have different problems than we do. Our big problem in America is going to be how do we generate jobs and growth and wealth for a growing population. I don't see any other issue that is nearly as important in the next 20 or 30 years, and I personally think that whichever political party delivers that will be the one that will do best. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop with this just to, because I think this is the most arresting of all the statistics, and I think it really suggests something that America is going to have to deal with. I mean, I think we see a little bit of this in the Copenhagen situation, where the U.S. really is more constrained in how it can deal with some of the climate change issues, if you're into that, as opposed to countries like Japan and much of Europe, where the population growth is much less. How we get to 100 million people and succeed is really what the book is about, really what my main concern is about, and I think it should be the issue that Washington should be concerned with as well. So.
Thank you. Can I just pose one little question to you, Joel? One of the suggestions in your book, which is that we will see more growth in the heartland of America.
Right.
I mean, you could say that the century from 1810 to 1910 was growth. Americans fled the coasts and moved to the heartland. 1910 through 2010, roughly, we tend to go back to the coasts. We get the big cities in New York, California, and so forth. You're saying that the movement is going to be, there will be significant movement to the heartland. Could you just amplify on that a little?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the interesting things is now that movement does not mean these little towns in the middle of North Dakota and South Dakota are going to come back. A lot of them are going to actually disappear. But there's quite a bit of vital growth in, like, for instance, Fargo, North Dakota. When I first started going to Fargo 10 years ago, you couldn't get a decent meal. I had to bring my own coffee because the coffee was so terrible. The downtown was a kind of disaster. Now they've got a boutique hotel, several good restaurants, lots of coffee shops, and even a store for metrosexuals. So obviously something has changed in these communities. Sioux Falls, South Dakota is another one. And a lot of these heartland cities, Des Moines, Omaha, are showing a lot of life. And even if you take a little bigger example of that, Kansas City has had positive in-migration, has had some population growth. So I think that you're going to see movement into the interior, not necessarily because people would prefer the interior to the coast, but the question of affordability, job creation. People are going to have to look at other options. Every generation gets different options. Us boomers, we were able to have a great choice about where we wanted to live. But I look at the options for, let's say, somebody who's 30 now without inherited money wanting to live in Los Angeles. It would be very, very difficult.